Rahim. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for having me this morning, Ustaz Burhanuddin, for inviting me. It is indeed always a privilege to talk to people. This is a privilege from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I don't think anybody, whether professor or student or scholar, should take an audience for granted, because time is the most precious thing that we all have. And so if somebody is going to occupy your time, they should feel gratitude that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted them that privilege. Inshallah, ya Rabbi, inshallah, this morning is of benefit to all of you and to me included, bi'iznillah. So let me share my screen, if that's possible on my end here. All right, so this morning our topic, as you know, is innovation in the Quran. And what we're going to do is cover three broad areas. We're going to talk about the Maqasidi worldview, because I think the first thing that we have to understand is, how does someone who comes from the Maqasid perspective, or even from a Tawheedi episteme, to think in a Tawheedi way, how do we approach the world? So not only the innovation phenomenon that we're going to be talking about this morning, but what if you were to approach the Quran looking for other phenomena or other questions? So this is something that we can take up, inshallah, in the discussion. The second is, we're going to define knowledge. What does knowledge mean in the world in which we live today? And how have we come to understand it? And how does the Quran correct that understanding, the Quran and the Sunnah? And finally, we're going to examine innovation in the Quran. Where is it in the Quran? How does it occur? What makes it possible? And what is the nature of the guidance associated with innovation? So this is a kind of picture of the Maqasidi worldview, or tasawwur, how we think of the world in broad terms. So as you can see, Tawheed is the overall arching hegemonic belief that we have as Muslims. And because we believe in Tawheed, we believe in the unity of creation. Everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created is unified, even in its diversity. So three principles come out of this unity of creation. The first is purpose, the second is connection, and the third is holism. So the first principle of purpose, or purposefulness, means that we all have an overall objective of being on this earth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as you all know, tells us in the Quran, that is to worship Him. There's no other reason. It's just to worship Him. And so we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we can do that in two primary ways. The first way is we do it through glorification, prayers, and our rituals. This is one way that we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second way is that we obey the command, obedience of the command of Allah, and this concerns everything else in our life. So there's two ways we obey Allah's command. The first is willful, and the second is decreed. So in the willful, right, it's by choice, and we do that in two ways. Through fiqh, we have to understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking us as it relates to our personal lives, to our professional lives, to the world around us. And the second is through inspiration or revelation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to various aspects of nature how to be, because we're not only talking about humans here. This is a worldview about everything, right? This is about the unity of creation. Or we figure things out through different modes and methods and techniques of understanding. And then we have the decreed. The decreed simply means that we have no choice. So there's things like we're all women here, for instance, or most of us. So something decreed would be childbirth. This is decreed. We have no choice. I mean, you can choose not to have children, but it is decreed that the woman have a child, that we carry the child, that we are the vessels that give birth. That is, for instance, something decreed. It is not something by choice. Now, because everything in the world is purposeful and has a purposeful path, we also know that everything is connected, right? Because if things were not connected, it would be chaotic. So I can't have a path that is completely different than all the paths around me. Somehow my path and the path of everything else in creation is connected, right? So there's two ways that also works out. It's either a moral religious connection or it's a material physical connection. And in the moral religious, our relationships in the Quran are defined by mercy. And this is a very interesting and beautiful way to connect humanity, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He explains to us that we are all a product of the rahim being mistranslated or very poorly translated as the womb, because the rahim in the Quran is a name that is derived from Allah's name, Ar-Rahman. We know this from a sacred narration, a sacred hadith, where Allah tells us, subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He created the rahim, washtaqilha, and He cleaved for her a name from His name. And whoever keeps connections with the rahim, Allah will keep connections with him. And whoever severs connections with the rahim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will sever his connection with him or her. So our moral and religious connections and our material connections are all based on rahmah. They're all based on mercy. Now that moral and religious connection has three major divisions. The first connection that all of creation has is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is a dependent connection. So it's a one-way thing. We depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He does not depend on us. The second is an interdependent relationship. And the interdependent relationship has two components as well. So the first intra-dependent relationship is between you and yourself. Okay? So what does that mean? It's between you and yourself. Well, there is the you that acts in this world and behaves, and there is the you that is your will, the voice inside you that guides you. So your relationship with that self is your relationship with you. So do you listen to that self? Do you develop that self? What is that will, and how do we develop it? Because you know how when you're doing something or when you're thinking something, and then there's another voice talking to you. Do you ever stop and think, what is that voice? You know, when you're about to do something and you're like, is that the right thing to do? Who is that talking to you? That's you. That's your will. And so the idea is, how do you develop a relationship with that will, and how do you cultivate that will so that it becomes a strong advisor for you in this world? It becomes a truthful advisor. So that is an interdependent relationship. Nobody sees that relationship or feels it but you. You're the one who hears that voice, and hopefully that voice is always giving you good guidance. And then we have the relationship between men and women, believers in Islam, and we know this is intradependent. Your relationship with all believers is intradependent. We know this from the Quran, ba'dukum min ba'd. You are one of another. And then we have the interdependent relationship, which is you with all the other believers, you and the believers with everybody, with everything else in the universe. This is an interdependent relationship. So everything is connected. Now you'll notice that there is no independent relationship in Islam. There's no independent. The Quran does not present us with anything that is not truthful. It never talks about independence. There's no such thing. We were created as human beings from alaq. From the very beginning, we were created from something that clings, that attaches, that is dependent. That is what alaq means. Alaq, yata'allaq, it means to latch on to something. And from the very beginning, to survive, we have to latch on in the mother's womb. This is how we survive. And so we are created from our very essence by something that is dependent and that attaches and connects to other things. So there's no independence. But there is, if you're wondering, individuality. So the idea of an individual is in the Quran. All of us are individuals, okay? And all of us are autonomous, because there's a difference between independence, autonomy, and individualism. Each and every single one of us is an individual. We have, like our fingerprints, individual. No two people have the same fingerprint. We're individuals. We're also autonomous. And what does autonomy mean? Autonomy means that we have this will that I was talking about. You have the capacity to make choices, but that's different than independence, because in your very essence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed a core of moral ideas, principles that command everybody, every human being, whether they're a believer or not a believer. There is this base. And so even when we talk about autonomy, we're still not talking about independence. And finally, all of this leads to holism. So if everything is purposeful in nature and has a purposeful path, and everything is connected, then it must be leading to something greater than all of us. And that greater something also shares a number of principles. First of all, it's constructive, right? It builds towards something constructive. It leads towards that glorification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's also very diverse. It's diverse in the ways that we glorify and we worship and we carry through those purposeful paths. It's measured. Nature is measured. Everything in nature, everything in the universe comes in measure and balance. Okay, so together, these three foundations, this triangular foundation of purposeful connectivity and holism, define a maqasidi world view. Now, what does that mean when we study knowledge? And that is what an innovation, and that's what we're covering today. Well, first of all, we have to think, how do we understand knowledge in the world in which we live? Now, knowledge in the mainstream view, if any of you are mostly economists or have studied this from, different vantages, you'll realize that knowledge is facts, information, and certain understandings generated by humans. This is what is accepted as knowledge in the world in which we live. If you came, to university, at least here in the secular West, and you were to bring something from the Quran or something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, this would not be considered knowledge. Knowledge is normally treated as a public good, which means that it's for the benefit of society and it's provided without profit. Now, this created a problem in the Western secular world, because that meant that knowledge and the creation of knowledge was not commercialized. It couldn't be commercialized. It wasn't profitable, and they wanted it to be profitable. So we have this phase of the commodification of knowledge. Knowledge becomes a commodity, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not intend it to be a commodity. We're going to see that in a moment. But we see it emerge as a commodity. And that's because it's characterized by three features, right? So the first is that knowledge is indivisible, right? So if you acquire a unit of knowledge, it's a one-time event. After this, anybody can use it without further cost. So if I give you an idea this morning, this idea pops in your head, you can go use it for the rest of your life and it wouldn't make a difference. It's just the production, the first instance of production, that is costly. After that, it can be used freely. The second is what characterizes this knowledge production is uncertainty. So it's difficult to estimate how much investment we need up front to come up with any idea, how much time we need, how much resources, how many researchers, how much money, all of this stuff. When you embark on a journey of knowledge in any field, there's no guarantee as to when you will have something tangible and usable. And finally, this leads to what we call the inappropriability of knowledge. So because of these features, in the absence of legal protection, it's difficult or impossible to appropriate, to gain the returns generated from investments in knowledge. So if I were to spend 5 years writing my next book, and then I put the book out there, anybody could use it. It's almost impossible to appropriate all the returns from that knowledge. Or if someone, for instance, as you've all heard in the pharmaceutical industry, were to come up with a drug, once that drug is put on the market, without these legal protections, it would be impossible for them to protect it or to gain the returns from it. Now, do I believe that? Absolutely not. The pharmaceutical industry is very complex, and the fact that there is a company that is a front runner means that they are making a lot of money in the beginning. Do they need to keep making that money through intellectual property? We can have that discussion later. But I'm just telling you how it's viewed in the world today. Now, knowledge in the Quran, what is the difference? How do we think of knowledge differently? Well, first of all, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has complete knowledge. And this is something, again, for those of you who've studied economics, you will know that the economic man apparently has complete knowledge, so that they could do their little economic models. But we know from the Quran that only Allah has this power. Nobody else has the power of complete knowledge. And knowledge for us is associated with truth. So in the Quran, knowledge and truth are almost interchangeable. So knowledge cannot be a lie. I cannot teach you something in Islam that is a lie or that is not a truth and call it a unit of knowledge. This is not part of the Western or secular paradigm. So truth about the nature of creation and its connections, their purposeful paths, and their infinite interdependencies. And how do we know this? Well, the very, very first command in the Quran was what? Iqra. Iqra in the name of whom? Basma Abdelgafar khalaq, your Lord that created. Right? He didn't say Basma Rabbika Rahman or Basma Rabbika Al-Ghafur or Bismillah. He said Basma Rabbika alladhi khalaq, the Lord that created. So you are to read in the name of that Lord that created. And I think that this command in particular and the use of that name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Rabbika alladhi khalaq, was a reassurance for the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, because you all know the incident when he says, Ma ana biqari, I am not a reader, I am not a reciter. And he was pressed by Sayyidina Jibreel, Iqra. And so when he says, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, he has this read in the name of your Lord who created. So you're not just going to read books. You're going to read the world. You're going to read the universe. And when you think that the Prophet ﷺ, before this instant and in his youth, had spent 13 years as a shepherd, right? 13 years guarding sheep and studying sheep and analyzing their behavior. And I have a whole course on sheep and his experience with sheep, ﷺ. So all of a sudden, he's giving him something familiar. I'm not necessarily right now at this moment because the Quran had not been revealed. I'm not asking you to read the word. I'm asking you to read the world. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. And so there's truths involved. And the Quran then distinguishes between creation and discovery. People cannot make something out of nothing, the Quran tells us. The Quran asks, were people created out of nothing or did they create? So we do not create anything. Human beings don't create, we discover. We also read in the Quran, what have those other than Allah created? What have they created of the earth? Or do they have a share of the sky? Bring forth a book or any shred of evidence or knowledge if you're saying the truth. So the Quran challenges us, and it is very dangerous when we say we've created something, because we don't create. Humans don't create. We just discover things. And even when we bring things together, when we bring things together in different ways, it's still a process of discovery, not creation. Now, I went back to this slide. Oh, I don't think we could do this morning because we're so many people. All right. So if I were to ask you, and I want you to think about it before I flip to the next slide, what is knowledge like? And when we study the Sunnah, we have this whole list of what knowledge is about in the Sunnah. And I really love the first one. I want you to think about it and reflect on it. That's the whole point, right, girls, of our faith. Tadabbur al-Quran, reflecting upon the Quran, reflecting upon the Sunnah, understanding the meaning of the hadith, and does it conform to our understandings of the Quran? So the first is that knowledge is like rain. And when you think, well, why would the Prophet ﷺ say that? Well, think of the properties of rain, right? Think of what the Quran tells us about rain in the Quran. How does it penetrate the earth? How does it produce, flowers and all kinds of diverse produce? How does it give life to human beings, right? How is it available for everybody? So what are the properties of rain? And that's what these ahadith encourage us to do, to be thinkers as Muslim, right? To discover things by doing this tadabbur, having this process. So you don't read and say knowledge is like rain and you just walk away. That's when you have to stop and say, why is knowledge like rain? What can I learn from this? What can I teach others through this? How can I improve my research through this? How can I be a better person through this, right? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that knowledge revives humanity, how can I then have knowledge and not share it, right? So we're also told that our deeds obviously accept three things, stop at our death, and knowledge is one of them, knowledge utilized for the benefit of people. And the point I was just making, to witness knowledge, those who witness knowledge should inform the absent. So, inshallah, if you were to learn something this morning and appreciate it, you go on and you teach it to others. And inshallah, in the Q&A, when I listen to your concerns and I learn something from you, I am to share it with others. Knowledge can escape us if we don't operationalize it. This is another thing. So when you learn something in university or in your studies, or, the idea is if you do not operationalize it, if you do not put it into practice, we are going to lose it. It becomes lost. We know that above every knower is a knower, so anybody with knowledge must remain humble. We know that knowledge is the inheritance of humanity, which means that when we lose it anywhere, we lose it everywhere. And this is one of the points that I'm going to make, inshallah, in my speech at Parliament tomorrow. It's a major teaching in our faith that as we're losing these scholars, these poets in Gaza and in Palestine, we're losing the heritage of humanity, the inheritance of humanity, and everybody has a stake in that. Knowledge is to be obtained for Allah's pleasure. There's another beautiful thing in Islam, is that it encourages men and women and youth to obtain knowledge for Allah's pleasure. And you can see why in Islam, because we have this worldview where we start with La ilaha illallah. We start with believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that when we set out on our journey of discovery, if that journey is truthful, it'll only bring us back to that point of La ilaha illallah and subhanallah, right? It's not going to take us anywhere else. And this is also very different than the secular paradigm, which falsifies everything as a starting point. We do not falsify everything as a starting point. We take as fundamental truths what the Quran tells us are truths. Whoever is asked about knowledge and keeps it a secret, Allah will harness him, God forbid, with a harness made of fire on the day of judgment. Whoever teaches people what is beneficial is prayed for by others. And the Prophet ﷺ also told people and encouraged them, do as you know for the benefit of your affairs. So within the context of this understanding of this Islamic framework, you are to do what your context requires. So you're not to go adopt, a policy or an idea that came out from somewhere else that does not apply to your people or your land or your systems. You are to figure out what you need for your context. And that's how knowledge grows. So what is the difference between knowledge and innovation? Knowledge is what we were just talking about. It's these truths. Innovation then is the use of that knowledge to develop new ideas, products, services, and methods. It is the application of our intelligence, our human ingenuity, to raw materials, products, services to develop something new and useful. And of course, because we are coming from the Islamic perspective, it has to have the component of morality and goodness, or ihsan and ma'ruf. These are things that are not included in the secular Western paradigm. Again, so they can consider something to be innovative or based on knowledge that is haram. We don't have that in our faith. For us, it has to also have that component of morality. It has to be something permissible. Okay, so we have that added safeguard so to speak. And this kind of thinking shaped all kinds of innovations in the past, starting from this premise of truth and morality. And of course, I mean, this was not in all cases, you know, let's not be idealistic and naive. Not everybody who innovated from the Islamic or Muslim world necessarily started from that, but we can say that a good majority did. And that had an impact on the strength of the ummah over the course of history when it came to innovating. Now, how do we approach the Quran to figure all of this out? So at the Maqasid Institute, where I come from, we developed a methodology that, this is the framework of the methodology, that involves repeated cycles of reflection, right? So the idea is, how do we read and reread the Quran in a way that enables us to deeply study the concern we have or the purpose we have when we are approaching the Quran and the associated Sunnah. So that methodology involves reading and repeated cycles of reflection. It involves looking at the ayat or sets of ayat to extract from them the truths that we need to understand the concerns with which we're approaching the Quran. Now, in order to do that, we developed a framework, and the framework has 7 components. So when you're reading the ayat of the Quran, whether it's one ayah or a set of ayat, because not every ayah will include all 7 components. Sometimes it's a set of ayat, and as you know, in the Quran, the sets of ayat, or even a singular ayat, can represent a certain method of the Quran. So an ayah, for instance, can be a simile. It can be an example, or it can take several ayat to give that example. The ayat also form narratives. They form dialogue. We see repetitions. So the Quran has different techniques, uses the ayat in different ways to teach people, right? To impact our psyche in different ways. So it'll give me an example in one instance. It'll give me a narrative or a story in another. It'll give me just dialogue. And sometimes it'll just state it as a command or as a prohibition. And so what we do when we study the ayat is we look for these 7 elements. And it's easy to remember. It's not put in this order here, but you can just remember the acronym cover-up. So we're looking to understand the concepts, the objectives, the values, the rules, the universal laws, the parties, and the proofs, right? That's easy for us to remember. So in looking for the concepts, we're looking to understand how the Quran defines innovation. Now, most of you think, I've never seen innovation in the Quran. And this was me in the beginning, you know, where is innovation in the Quran? Because I was so programmed in my Western secular education. I couldn't see innovation in the Quran. I couldn't see what I was reading, right? Other than knowledge and truth and these things. So the concepts help us understand the truths of what we're looking for. Then we have the objectives. So what are the objectives? What's the purpose of innovation or knowledge? What are the rules that are associated with it? What are the values? What am I supposed to do with this? What are the standards of worth that the Quran is attaching to knowledge? I mean, we just looked at that the Sunnah, for instance, and said knowledge is an act in and of itself that we do for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we know it has a very high value in Islam. What are the universal laws associated with it? Like a universal law, like I said earlier, is that it is shared among all of humans. A unit of knowledge, a truth, cannot be protected by something like intellectual property. It's something that's available for everybody. Who are the parties involved in this process of innovation? And finally, what are the proofs? The proofs are the hujaj. And this is perhaps the most difficult part of the framework. When students are using it, they don't fully understand what the hujaj means. And what it simply means is, what is the evidence that the Quran is providing to make its point? What are the arguments? How is it showing a truthful argument from a false argument? So it's the how of innovation. Now, if we were to look at it, and this is just like a little scribble, innovation in the revelation. And I told you, I started with this idea of there's no innovation. And then one day I was like, what do you mean there's no innovation in it? The Quran talks about ships. This was my first realization when I stopped and I said, why is the Quran mentioning ships in the middle of this ayah? And I was, well, a ship is an innovation. It's not something in nature. That's something that humans had to apply their ingenuity to make, to discover. That's, you know, you're not walking along and you see a tree and you see a ship beside it. That's not the way it works. So like, there is innovation in the Quran. And then I began to think, okay, there's ships, there's transportation vessels, there's lofty palaces, there's mobile homes, there's armor, there's tunnels, there's walls, there's ladders, there's even institutional innovations if you look deeply enough. And it's like, there is innovation in the Quran. There is an emphasis on the application of human ingenuity. And how is that possible? How is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pointing us to that? Well, it's something called the enablers. What is musakhar? And what is musakhar in the Quran is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitated so that we could put it towards innovation. Now, what is musakhar? When you read the Quran, at-taskhir, that Allah makes enabling, that Allah, you know, we tend to misunderstand the word taskhir, especially in the translations, as subjugated. Okay, I want you to erase that from your mind. Nothing in this world is subjugated to us. Okay, everything has its own purpose and worships Allah. What happens is Allah, out of His mercy, enabled us to utilize it, but it is not subjugated to us. Why? Because taking a simple example, the sun and the moon are musakhar. Can you alter the sun and the moon? Is it subjugated to you? No. Right? You always have to remember that. So just because something is musakhar does not mean it is subjugated. We are even subjugated. We are even musakhar to each other. Right? The Quran tells us this, that you are musakhar for each other so that you can commission each other in different works. Does that mean if you are commissioning me, like this morning, you're commissioning me to come and teach you? Does that mean I am subjugated to you? No. We are musakhar for each other. Is not a process of subjugation. And the idea that things are subjugated has led us to be very destructive human beings because we think of creation as something lesser. We think of creation as something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put under our command. And this is not true. It is not under our command because we started with the concept of purposefulness, right? Everything has purpose and we have to understand its purposeful path before we set out to utilize and manipulate it. So we see this concept of enablers in the Quran: the water, the rivers, the seas, the wind, the clouds, the atmosphere, the earth, the wood, the iron, the fire, the sun, the stars, the moon. The Quran tells us human nature in its different degrees, insects, animals, atoms, subatomic things. All of that is musakhar, which means it allows us to apply our ingenuity so that we can come up with innovation. So we look at the concepts and we see what are the concepts associated with innovation. Well, obviously knowledge, enablement, which is the taskhir, ownership and property, benefit or manfa, balance or mizan, creation, endowment, prevention, time. All of these things are associated concepts that we would need to understand what innovation means in the Quran. We would also look at the values associated with it. So mercy, gratitude, equity, universality. And we know that because when we look at the objectives, you know, the why of innovation in the Quran, we see, okay, seeking Allah's pleasure is number one. Human dignity is another, you know, the construction of homes, the wearing of clothes, all of these are the application of human ingenuity, trade, saving of lives. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He allows us to make armor and defense things, this is to save lives. It's not to take lives. It challenges our intellect, trade, shelter, health, all of these, nutrition, all of these are objectives of innovation in the Quran. And then there's rules associated with it. So we're not allowed to have monopolies as Muslims. We should be applying collective decision-making when it comes to innovation. It has to be something tangible. It has to be something useful. It has to be something beneficial. There's universal laws associated with innovation. So a universal law is every human has this capacity. Everything is purposeful. Everything is in balance. We also have the capacity to, unfortunately, corrupt, but also to rectify. So we have these rejection of reform by vested interests. We also see this in the Quran. This is a universal law. If you're going to introduce something new, people are normally going to reject it to begin with. So we're also taught about these things if you read in the Quran deep enough and you do enough cycles. Who are the parties in the Quran? Well, you have the masterminds and the innovators. You have the enablers. You have the recipients, those who are going to use and benefit from the technologies. And you also have the elements of wider governance in the Quran. When we're talking about institutional innovations, like the ones we saw with Sayyidina Yusuf, for instance, when he took over the stores of the grain stores of Egypt to save the people, you see institutional innovation here. You see how it benefits the people, you know, what he did and the plan, the strategy he put forward in order to for the people not to go into famine, for the people not to starve. These are all institutional innovations, and there's many, many examples in the Quran. And finally, the proofs in the Quran, we see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, remember the question of how he made enabling these things. So he's telling us, you know, what is the truth? What is the truth of the evidence, and what is a false way of arguing? So a false way of arguing, for instance, would be that we see in the Quran is when if things are not subjugated, then people don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you can't get the moon to go from the west instead of the east, that is somehow a proof. And the Quran tells us this is not a proof. You know, this is not a way to look at the world, because you can't do that either. So again, if you focus, you'll see how the Quran talks to us about the how. Now, what makes innovation possible? Right. And what does the Quran teach us? First of all, observation of phenomena. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us what happens. He says in the Quran, water flows carry contaminants that are the products of combustion used for making adornments and other human desires. So that's a truth. If we were back then, of course, it would have been difficult, but now we know that. We know that waters carry contaminants that are the products of combustion. So this is a very incredible ayah. The Quran also tells us, for instance, you know, to observe the sky. He tells us he raised it and placed a balance that you may not transgress the balance, and maintain weights with equity, that you may not diminish the balance. Now, when we think of the sky, when Allah tells us that he raised it with a balance, think of the composition of the atmosphere, right? How it's measured in proportion, certain elements. So you have about 75% of it is nitrogen, 23% is oxygen, 0.053, it's a very intricate percent is argon. So this balance, and we don't normally think of this ayah in this way, but there's a balance that keeps the sky up. And when we alter as human beings, when we corrupt, when we pollute, what happens to that balance? There's more carbon dioxide. We have global warming. We have that ceiling of the sky come down. And what happens is the earth warms up. And when the earth warms up, everything is thrown off balance. And that's in that ayah. If we focus and we study that ayah. So observation of phenomenon. The second is observation of Allah's design. So how did they design ships? They looked at the structure of a whale. When you look at the structure of a whale, that's what our ships look like. That's what our submarines look like. Look at the birds. The only way they perfected, by the way, flight, was when they finally studied the aerodynamics of birds. Look at the sun. That's how we're coming up with solar energy and different types of energy. Look at the bees. The bees teach us about institutional developments, because we know that the bees, scientifically, have the best method for collective decision making. And that is so fascinating, subhanAllah. Go back to the scientific literature, particularly in Germany, and the headlines are all how bees, subhanAllah, can teach us to make decisions. So when Allah tells us that the process of decision making in Islam is called shura, all of you are familiar with that, yes? Nod your heads. Shura, you've heard of shura. What does shura mean? Shura means the extraction of honey from its source. This is the literal meaning of shura. So when you realize that, you say, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala link shura, this consultative, collective decision-making process, with honey? Why? Because he's linking it to the bees. He's telling us, go observe the bees, and the bees will teach you about institutional design. It's fascinating. It also tells us to observe previous innovations. So consider the ships and the buildings and the pillars and the armor and the walls and the pen. This is previous innovations. He's pointing us to look at what is before you and you can build upon this. And finally, as we said, there is that magnificent and merciful concept of taskhir. So it is Allah who sakhar for you the sea so that ships may sail in it with his command and to seek his bounty, that you may be grateful. And sakhara for you what is in the skies and the earth, all for him. Indeed, in this are ayat for a people that think. So this concept of taskhir also makes innovation possible. So what are the examples of taskhir? He tells us out of green trees, we can kindle fire. Straight out, he's telling us what we can do with what he created for us. He told us we can soften iron, like Sayyidina Dawood did, to make coats of mail and rings of chain and armor. He told us that he positioned the stars so we could navigate. The sun and the moon, he subjected to precise calculations so we could know the number of years and days and hours. And this is never a mechanical existence because, you know, there's always a reminder that the stars and the trees and everything in nature glorifies Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and prostrates to his majesty. So this is always the reminder that even if we can utilize these things, we are not to overstep our boundaries and think again that they are subjugated to us. And he gives us many, many more examples. Now, what does all of this do when we begin to study and think of innovation or any phenomenon, by the way, in the Quran in this way? What is the impact? What is the impact that it's having on us as believers? How is it altering our minds and our thinking? So you'll see in this little graph here what happens. So you, little me and little you, have a reality. And this reality, where's my thing? This is your reality. And this is your truth. So you have a reality and you have a truth. Now, when you study the Quran, when you apply a methodology to understanding, when you're looking for these 7 elements, for instance, in the ayat, when you're reflecting, you are moving along this trajectory right here. You know, this is an integrated knowledge of the ayat. So if you're thinking in parts, you're probably going to stay in your reality. We're going to read the Quran and all you're going to see is what you want to see. But as you move up on this trajectory, you move more and more out of this singular reading to an integration of the ayat and what I call an objectivization of your cognition. Now, what that means is you're moving from this subjective reality of it's all about me and my truths and my reality to I'm now beginning to understand reality as it is for other people, other beings, other creation in the universe. And I'm moving towards Allah's truths and less of my own prejudices and biases. So as we move along this, we become more actual, we increase our actuality, and we increase our authenticity. And it's in this area here where we're entering the real, not our real only, and we're entering the truths that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us, that we enter the renewal or zone where we can innovate in a way that the Quran has taught us we can innovate based on reality and understanding these purposeful paths and these connections and how they lead to holism, and based on the truths of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is a very important way of thinking of what happens to our perception when we study the Quran. All right. Where did my little, here it is. So what is the nature of guidance associated with this divine mercy? Well, as I just said, just because we have the innovation capability or even the need to innovate, it doesn't mean that we can derail the purposefulness of creation or destroy connectivity or corrupt wholeness. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us this ingenuity, this ability to apply our intelligence, but not to perform those three things. So as human beings, we cannot corrupt and then corrupt further by trying to fix our corruption through corruption. So an example I'll give you, for instance, in this, because I originally come from science and tech background, that really bothers me, is when we begin to genetically engineer nature for our comfort. So for instance, there was a project a while ago to genetically engineer or to change the genes of mosquitoes. Now, the problem with that is it's so short-sighted and it is within a very narrow view of the world. We're thinking of a very, very, very small problem, and we're altering the genetic code of a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have no idea of the implications of that, either geographically in the moment in which we're living or over the long run. This is the same thing with the genetic modification of crops, where they have made them sterile, so that if the seeds were to blow over into other fields, it would sterilize the crops in the other fields, and we wouldn't have seed for the next harvest. So just because we have the ability to innovate doesn't mean that we can derail the purposefulness of creation. In essence, what the Quran and what our faith teaches us is to return to first principles, to remember, to understand how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this balance and this measure, and not to defy it. We have to then understand what innovation means for moral and material connectivity. So inshallah, many of you are perhaps scientists or going to be scientists, and even if you're not, even in the social sciences, we have to understand what this means for our morality and our physical connection. What will this innovation introduce into our families, into our communities? And is it something that contributes to islah, rectification, or ihsan, beautification? So innovation, in essence, for us, is to protect Allah's order. It's not to destroy it. It's not to derail it. It's not to distort it. It's to protect it and to protect ourselves. So then we as Muslims have to distinguish between what we can subject to profitability and commercial interests and what we must share with humanity. Does that make it a less profitable world for Muslims? Maybe, maybe we are not going to be the trillionaires that create a drug that we then protect and we don't share with humanity because we want to make profits. But for a Muslim, this is a short life, and our accountability is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And trust me, there's a lot of profit in just being the first to invent or to innovate.